Andrea Mantegna married Giovanni Bellini's sister Nicolosia in 1453. It was a strategic alliance that led to one of the most creative dialogues of the Italian Renaissance. The National Gallery has brought together around 90 artworks, including rare international loans, Bellini's presentation of Christ in the Temple from Venice's Fondazione Querini, and Mantegna's version, lent by the Gemäldegalerie Gallery in Berlin.
The exhibition unites really, in many cases, for the first time, paintings that we think are influenced by each other. They tell a story of one artist having had access to the composition or to the painting of the other. But then at the same time, they're not exactly the same. They're actually also illustrations of how different these two artists are.
Their similarities and differences are exemplified in the two versions of the Agony in the Garden. While Mantegna focuses on details, Jerusalem is beautifully rendered. Bellini's painting is all about form, colour and atmosphere.
I think it is worth mentioning the very different careers these artists had. Giovanni Bellini was born into artistic royalty, you may say, and to a distinguished family in Venice. His father, Jacopo Bellini, was already a very well-known painter. By contrast, Andrea Mantegna is the son of a carpenter. He really comes out of nowhere.
The pair spent around 7 years working in close collaboration. Each admired the other's technique. Bellini was influenced by Mantegna's foreshortening of bodies, while Mantegna was impressed with Bellini's landscapes. Together, they were two of the most influential painters of their era.
I think it is very hard to imagine Venetian painting in the 16th century without the influence of Giovanni Bellini. I'm thinking in particular of Veronese, of Tintoretto, of the Bassano workshop. I think it is very hard to imagine what they would have done were it not for the foundation that Giovanni Bellini laid. And Andrea Mantegna too. His influence is felt in the painting that you see in Padua, in Verona, in Mantua, but also partly in Venice. Artists throughout, really from the late 15th century onwards up to the present day, have found inspiration in the work of Mantegna, even contemporary artists today.
The National Gallery exhibition is the first time Mantegna and Bellini have been exhibited together, and seeing their work side by side, as well as details about their relationship as brothers-in-law, provides new context to their work. Mantegna and Bellini is open until January in London, and will then travel to Berlin in March. Miranda Atty TRT World, London.
Art critic Michael Prodger joins me now from London to talk about the unique relationship between the two Italian masters. Hi Michael, thanks for joining us.
Hello there.
So Michael, obviously Mantegna and Bellini have a very interesting story, but I'm just curious how you would define their relationship. It's not really clear to me. For example, should we see them as mere rivals?
I think they learned from each other. I think in some senses they were not quite collaborative in that they never worked on a painting or a project together. But they clearly looked at each other's paintings and took the best bits of each other's work and incorporated into their own. So, and I think they acknowledged this too. This was not a case of some artists such as Raphael would look at Leonardo or Michelangelo and use bits of their procedures in his own paintings, but he wouldn't let on. In the case of Bellini and Mantegna, I think they were quite open about the fact that they did borrow from each other or learn from each other.
But what exactly did they learn from each other in terms of style, techniques or subjects?
Well, it was less technique than style and subject, in that they both had distinct strengths. Not so much weaknesses, but they certainly had strengths. So Mantegna's great strength was the human figure, and how that related to classical antiquity. He was an intellectual in a way, and he learnt a lot from Roman sculpture. He grew up in Padua, which had a great number of Roman remains and had always been a centre of learning. So he looked at the human body, looking at Roman sculptures, and saw its sculptural qualities, and was part of that Renaissance rediscovery of classical antiquity, seeing it as beautiful in its own right, pagan if you like. This was slightly outside the Christian ethos, but nevertheless something of merit. Bellini's great strength was as a colourist. He had a way with colour that was quite instinctive and was very influential. So Bellini would look at Mantegna and how he dealt with classical ruins and how he dealt with the human figure and the sculptural quality that Mantegna gave it. And Mantegna would look at Bellini and look at his colour harmonies and the way that he integrated figures into both the landscape and into architectural settings.
And obviously art critics have been arguing about which one is a senior painter, which one is better. Do you think there is a consensus on that?
I don't think there is. I think one of the interesting things about this exhibition is to put the two artists side by side so that people can make up their own mind. I think if there is a consensus among art historians, it is that both were great painters. I think the word great is often overused in all sorts of spheres, and it is indeed in art history too. These two painters were, I think, undoubtedly great. I don't think you can say who was better. They were both working at the time of the mid to high Renaissance, when for some reason or other there were a whole spate of brilliant artists. They were exact contemporaries of Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael, so they were part of a great outpouring of talent.
So you mentioned that they were influenced from each other. But I'm wondering, to what extent was that the case? Some people, for example, say that neither's career would have existed without the other one. Do you think it's too much to say, or do you agree on that?
No, I think that's too much to say. I mean, they were both working as professional artists before they ever met each other, and indeed they met each other very rarely. They were brothers-in-law, and they really met in the early 1450s, when Nicolosia, who was Bellini's sister, married Mantegna. But Mantegna never worked in Venice. Bellini very rarely left Venice. So it wasn't as if they were working in the same place at the same time or on the same projects. So their access to the work of each other was fairly limited, and by the time that they met, the trajectory of each career was already partly established. Certainly Mantegna, by the time he joined the Bellini family and married into the Bellini family, he was already the most significant painter in Padua. He was still a very young man, but by the late 1440s he was the most significant painter there. And Bellini was part of a family of painters who had a great deal of commissions lined up as a family, and so he was working in that family tradition while Mantegna was ploughing his own distinct furrow slightly further inland from Venice. So I think they would both succeeded as artists. They would both still be great artists. The way that they influenced each other is quite subtle. In some places it's more obvious than others, but they would have been still significant figures whether they'd met each other or not.
Thank you, Michael, for this great insight.
Oh, you're very welcome.